Champagne flutes clinked. Laughter echoed through the grand ballroom of the Ashford estate, a sprawling Georgian manor that had been in the Sinclair family for 3 generations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm amber light over 200 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits. The string quartet played a sweeping waltz, and somewhere near the center of the dance floor, the bride, Julian's younger sister, Margot, was laughing as her new husband spun her in a dizzying circle. Outside, the November rain fell in sheets. Liam stood beneath the small stone portico at the rear of the manor, shivering violently in his torn bridesmaid's suit. The powder blue silk jacket was ruined, soaked through and stained with mud from where he'd fallen. His jaw throbbed with a sickening, heavy heat that radiated up into his skull, and he could taste copper on his tongue, sharp and metallic, pooling beneath his tongue where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. He pressed his back against the cold limestone wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and water dripped relentlessly down the back of his neck, soaking into the collar of his ruined shirt. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely grip the phone. 3 years. 3 years since he'd walked away from Dorian Blackwood. 3 years since he'd stood in that penthouse, looked the most dangerous man in the city in the eyes, and told him he couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't live with the paranoia, the guards, the secrets. 3 years since he'd convinced himself that he wanted a normal life, a safe life, a husband who went to work at 9 and came home at 6 and never made him wonder where the blood on his cuffs came from. He'd found that husband in Marcus Sinclair, and Marcus had spent the last 18 months systematically destroying every piece of him. Liam touched his jaw gingerly, and a small, broken sound scraped its way up his throat. It was swelling fast. He could feel the heat of it, the way the skin was already pulling tight. He'd seen the bruises Marcus left before. He knew what this would look like tomorrow. Purple and black and sickly yellow, spreading down his neck like a bruise that had metastasized. The music from inside pulsed through the floorboards, a steady rhythmic thrum that vibrated up through the soles of his soaked dress shoes. To anyone inside the grand ballroom, it was a night of celebration. His sister Margot, glowing in white silk, spinning on the dance floor with her new husband, the open bar flowing with top-shelf liquor, the air smelling of roasted beef and expensive perfume, and the heavy sweetness of white lilies. To Liam, the room was a cage shrinking by the minute. He'd sat at the head table, his posture rigid, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Beside him sat Marcus, his husband of 18 months, and to the rest of the room, Marcus was a charming investment banker with a winning smile and a generous laugh. He'd paid for the ice sculpture. He'd charmed their parents. He was currently nodding along to a story being told by a drunk uncle across the table, his white teeth flashing in the warm amber lighting. Under the tablecloth, his fingers had been dug into the soft flesh of Liam's thigh. Not a massage, a vice, his nails pressing through the thin silk of the powder blue suit. A warning, a physical tether reminding Liam exactly where he belonged and what would happen if he stepped out of line. "You're quiet tonight, darling," Marcus had murmured, leaning in close. His breath was warm against Liam's ear, smelling heavily of scotch and spearmint. "People are going to think you're not happy for your sister." "I'm happy," Liam had said, his voice flat and hollowed out. He forced the corners of his mouth upward. "Just tired." "Tired." Marcus rolled the word around in his mouth like a bad piece of meat. The pressure on Liam's thigh increased until a sharp, involuntary gasp escaped his lips. The drunk uncle across the table didn't notice. No one ever noticed. "You don't get to be tired, Liam. Not when I spent $4,000 on that suit you're wearing." "Smile." He had smiled. It felt like his face would crack. "I need to use the restroom," he'd whispered, keeping his eyes fixed on the centerpiece. Marcus's eyes flicked toward the exit, calculating. He slowly released his grip, smoothing the silk over Liam's leg in a mocking gesture of affection. 5 minutes. Don't speak to anyone on the way. You've had enough wine." Liam hadn't taken a single sip of his wine. He'd stood, his legs trembling, and navigated the maze of round tables. People waved at him. He offered them empty nods. As he pushed through the heavy mahogany doors leading to the lobby, the suffocating bass of the wedding band muffled into a dull thud. The hallway was empty, lined with vintage mirrors and floral wallpaper. He didn't go to the restroom. He needed air. He needed to breathe without smelling Marcus's cologne. He'd walked down the corridor, passing the coat check, and pushed open a side door that led to a secluded smoking patio. The cold November air hit him like a physical blow, snapping the stagnant fog in his brain. It had started to rain, a miserable, freezing drizzle that slicked the cobblestones. He stepped under the small canvas awning, wrapping his bare arms around himself, and closed his eyes. Just 2 more hours. I thought I said 5 minutes. Liam's eyes snapped open. Marcus stood in the doorway, the light from the hallway backlighting him, casting his face in shadow. The charm was gone. The smile had evaporated. He looked at Liam not like a husband, but like a dog that had chewed the furniture. I just needed some air, Liam said, his voice betraying him. It shook. He hated that it shook. Marcus stepped out onto the patio, letting the heavy door click shut behind him. The sound was deafeningly loud. Air? Or were you looking for that bartender you were making eyes at during the toast? He asked if I wanted water. You made me look like a fool. Marcus hissed, crossing the small space between them in 2 long strides. Liam backed up, his spine hitting the brick wall of the manor. I didn't do anything. Don't lie to me. Marcus's hand shot out. It wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist, a short, brutal punch aimed precisely at the side of Liam's jaw. The impact snapped his head to the side. His temple cracked against the brick. White light exploded behind his eyes, followed by a roaring tinnitus that drowned out the rain. He collapsed onto the wet cobblestones, his knees scraping against the rough ground, the metallic taste of copper flooding his mouth. He stayed on his hands and knees, staring at the puddles reflecting the dim patio lights. His jaw throbbed with a sickening, heavy heat. Marcus adjusted his cuffs, looking down at him. His chest heaved once, then settled. The rage vanished, replaced by cold annoyance. Look what you made me do. You've ruined the suit. Liam didn't move. He couldn't. I'm going back inside. Marcus's voice returned to its normal measured cadence. You have 10 minutes to clean yourself up in the restroom. If you aren't back at the table by the time they cut the cake, we are going home. And we both know what happens when we go home angry, don't we? He didn't wait for an answer. The door opened, releasing a brief swell of music, and clicked shut again. Liam remained on the wet ground. The freezing rain blew sideways under the awning, soaking his hair, gluing the ruined silk to his skin. He touched his jaw, and a small involuntary whimper scraped its way up his throat. It was swelling fast. He looked at the heavy door. Beyond it was the wedding, his family, and Marcus. Beyond it was the drive home, the isolated house in the suburbs, the basement stairs. If I get in that car tonight, he thought, the realization settling into his bones with terrifying clarity. He is going to kill me. His hands shook violently as he reached into the hidden pocket of his suit, pulling out his phone. The screen was cracked from a previous accident, but it turned on. He stared at the keypad. He didn't call the police. The police had come twice before. Marcus played the concerned husband, told them Liam had a drinking problem, and they'd left. The police required proof, patience, and a system. Liam didn't have time for a system. He had 10 minutes. His numb fingers punched in a number. 10 digits. He hadn't dialed it in 3 years, but his muscle memory knew it better than his own social security number. It was a number he had sworn to forget the day he walked away from a life he decided was too dark, too dangerous, to marry a safe, respectable investment banker. He pressed send, pressed the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice. Pick up. Please pick up. Miles away, in a windowless room beneath a high-end restaurant in the financial district, Dorian Blackwood sat at a steel table. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Dorian leaned back in his leather chair, watching the man kneeling on the tarp in front of him. He didn't look like a mob boss from the movies. He didn't wear pinstripes or heavy gold rings. He wore a simple, immaculately tailored black suit, and his dark hair was neatly trimmed. His pale gray eyes held the calm, detached intelligence of a predator observing a wounded animal. His scent, cold cedar and black pepper, dark and commanding, filled the room like a warning. "I'll have it by Tuesday," the kneeling man babbled, sweat pouring down his bruised face. "Dorian, I swear to God." "Tuesday." Dorian sighed softly. He picked up a silver lighter from the table, turning it over in his large hands. "You swore to God last Tuesday, Marcus. The problem with making promises to God in my basement is that God doesn't collect my debts." "I do." He nodded to the heavy-set man standing in the corner. The man stepped forward, pulling a heavy wrench from his coat. Before the heavy-set man could swing, Dorian's phone vibrated against the steel table. Dorian frowned. Very few people had this number: his lieutenant, his mother, and he looked at the screen. It was an unsaved number, but he recognized the digits instantly. A ghost from 3 years ago. The air in the room seemed to suddenly freeze. Dorian held up a hand. The heavy-set man lowered the wrench, stepping back into the shadows. Dorian picked up the phone and pressed it to his ear. He didn't say hello. He just listened. For a long moment, there was nothing but static and the ragged, shuddering sound of someone trying to breathe. Then a voice, small, cracked, trembling. "Can you come get me?" Dorian's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing creaked. He didn't ask how Liam was. He didn't ask why he was calling after 3 years of dead silence. He heard the wet, dragging sound of his breathing, the unmistakable slur of a swollen jaw. His eyes, usually empty and calm, darkened into something terrifying. The kneeling man on the tarp shrank back, suddenly realizing that whatever was happening on that phone call was infinitely more dangerous than his unpaid debt. "Where are you, Liam?" Dorian asked. His voice was a low rumble, perfectly level, devoid of any panic. "Ashford Estate." "The country club," Liam whispered. "I'm outside by the patio." "Are you alone?" "Yes." "Stay in the shadows," Dorian instructed, standing up from his chair. He tossed the silver lighter onto the table. "Do not go back inside. If anyone comes out, you run. I am leaving now." 10 minutes. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Dorian's voice softened, just slightly. "Look at the street. Keep your eyes on the road. I'll be the headlights." He hung up. He didn't put the phone in his pocket. He crushed it in his grip for a second, mastering the sudden violent surge of adrenaline in his blood. He turned to the men in the room. "Clean this up," Dorian said, pointing to the man on the tarp. "Put him in the alley. Tell him his debt is forgiven." The heavy-set man blinked, confused. "Forgiven, boss? I don't have time to kill him tonight." Dorian pushed open the heavy door. "I have somewhere to be." Back at the Ashford estate, the rain had turned into a steady freezing downpour. Liam crouched behind a decorative stone planter at the edge of the patio, hidden from the glass doors. His suit was ruined, soaked through and heavy with mud. The cold had seeped past his skin, settling deep into his organs, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably. He checked his cracked phone screen. 7 minutes had passed since Marcus left. The music inside shifted to something slow and romantic. He imagined his sister dancing. He imagined Marcus standing by the bathroom doors, checking his watch, his eyes narrowing as the seconds ticked by. "He's going to come looking for me." Panic, raw and blinding, clawed at his throat. He peered around the edge of the stone planter. The driveway leading up to the country club was empty, slick with rain under the amber streetlights. 8 minutes. He heard the heavy click of the patio door opening. Liam shoved his fist into his mouth to muffle a gasp, pressing his back flat against the freezing brick wall behind the planter. "Liam." Marcus's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the sound of the rain like a razor. It was the voice he used when the doors were locked and the curtains were drawn. "Liam, I checked the restroom. You aren't there." Footsteps crunched slowly on the wet gravel. He was walking toward the edge of the patio. "You're making a scene, darling. You know how much I hate scenes." Liam squeezed his eyes shut. His heart battered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "If you make me come out there and find you in the mud, it's going to be so much worse for you." Marcus's sing-song voice grew closer. His leather shoes stepped off the pavement and onto the grass. He was getting closer. Come out now, and I'll only lock you in the guest room tonight. Make me search, and I'll break the other side of your face. He was feet away. Liam could hear the rustle of Marcus's expensive suit jacket. He prepared to run, shifting his weight onto the balls of his feet, even though he knew he wouldn't make it to the street in heels. Then light flooded the driveway. Blinding, piercing white LED headlights cut through the torrential rain, throwing long, harsh shadows across the grass. Marcus stopped, raising a hand to shield his eyes from the glare. It wasn't one car. It was 3 massive black SUVs, moving in perfect predatory unison. The doors opened simultaneously. The men who stepped out didn't look like valets. They wore dark suits that hung heavy on large frames, their faces shadowed by umbrellas that snapped open in the downpour. They moved with silent, practiced efficiency, fanning out to form a perimeter around the lead car. Marcus's anger faltered, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his handsome features. What the hell is this? The rear door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out into the rain. He didn't take an umbrella from the guard who offered it. Dorian Blackwood walked up the patio steps, moving with the lazy, terrifying grace of a king surveying a battlefield. The rain slicked his dark hair to his forehead, soaking the shoulders of his tailored suit, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes bypassed Marcus entirely, sweeping the shadows of the patio. Liam, Dorian called out, his voice a deep, resonant anchor. Behind the planter, Liam let out a sob he couldn't contain. He scrambled up, his freezing mud-caked legs giving out for a second before he caught himself on the stone edge. Dorian saw him. The absolute stillness in his demeanor fractured. He crossed the patio in 3 strides, ignoring Marcus entirely, and dropped to one knee right in the mud before Liam. He didn't reach out to grab him. He knew better. He kept his hands visible, hovering just inches from Liam's shaking arms. I'm here, Dorian said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper meant only for him. His pale gray eyes scanned his face, lingering on the ruined silk of his suit, the mud on his knees, and finally the dark angry swelling on his jaw. A muscle feathered at the corner of Dorian's eye. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. Liam's teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak. You came. Of course I came. Dorian shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat and draped it gently over Liam's shaking shoulders. It smelled of rain, expensive tobacco, and cedar, Dorian's scent, warm and grounding. Can you walk? Liam nodded numbly, gripping the lapels of the coat. Excuse me. Marcus barked, stepping forward, his chest puffed out. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by the indignity of being ignored. Who the hell do you think you are? That is my husband. Dorian stood slowly. He didn't turn around immediately. He kept his body positioned between Liam and Marcus, a human shield of solid muscle and tailored wool. When Dorian finally turned, his face was a mask of terrifying indifference. He looked at Marcus the way a man might look at a cockroach before stepping on it. Your husband, Dorian repeated, tasting the words like poison in his mouth. Yes, my husband. Marcus took another step forward, trying to leverage his height. He pointed a finger at Liam. Liam, get over here right now. I don't know who this thug is, but you are embarrassing me. Dorian didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike a fighting stance. He simply took one step toward Marcus. 2 of the massive men by the SUVs reached inside their jackets, and the metallic click of safeties being disengaged was audible over the rain. Marcus froze. His eyes darted to the guards, then back to Dorian, the color rapidly draining from his face. You hit him, Dorian stated. It wasn't a question. He fell, Marcus stammered, taking a quick step backward. He was drunk. He slipped on the wet stones. He slipped, Dorian echoed softly. He tilted his head. Did you know, Marcus, that human bone requires roughly 4,000 newtons of force to fracture? I'm looking at his jaw, and I see a contusion that implies a localized blunt force impact, not a fall. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Who are you? I'm the consequence. Dorian closed the distance between them in a blink. His hand shot out, wrapping around Marcus's throat with blinding speed. He drove him backward, slamming him against the brick wall of the country club. The impact knocked the breath from Marcus's lungs in a wheeze. Dorian didn't squeeze to kill. He squeezed just enough to hold him pinned, his thumb pressing into the carotid artery. "Look at me," Dorian whispered, leaning in so close that Marcus could see the dead black promise in his pale gray eyes. "Look at me and understand what is happening right now." Marcus gagged, clawing frantically at Dorian's wrist, but the mob boss's arm was like cast iron. "You are going to go back inside," Dorian said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "You are going to sit at your table. You will smile. You will eat your cake. If anyone asks where your husband went, you will tell them he felt ill and took a cab home. You will never attempt to contact him again. You will not call his phone. You will not drive by his new location. If I hear that you so much as looked at a photograph of him..." Dorian leaned in a fraction of an inch closer. "I won't kill you, Marcus. Killing you takes 3 seconds. I will take you to a room where time stops. I will take away your hands, your teeth, and your charming fucking smile. And I will keep you alive long enough to regret the day you were born. Blink if you understand me." Marcus's tears of sheer terror mixed with the rain on his face. He blinked rapidly. Dorian released him. Marcus collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping greedily for air, clutching his bruised throat. Dorian didn't look at him again. He turned back to Liam, the cold violence instantly melting from his posture. He approached him, offering a hand. "Let's go home, Liam." Liam looked at the man gasping on the grass. The man he had feared for 18 months, reduced to nothing in 30 seconds. Then he looked at Dorian. He took his hand. It was warm. The heavy door of the SUV slammed shut, sealing them inside. The chaotic percussion of the freezing rain was instantly severed, reduced to a muffled patter against armored glass. Liam sank into the plush leather seat, his trembling fingers gripping the lapels of Dorian's wool coat. He pulled it tighter around his ruined suit, anchoring himself to the smell of tobacco, cedar, and rain. Dorian sat beside him. He didn't crowd his space, maintaining a careful, deliberate distance. He turned his attention to a small compartment built into the center console. The vehicle pulled away from the country club. Liam watched the amber streetlights bleed past the tinted windows. He waited for the adrenaline to crash. He expected to feel a crushing wave of guilt or the terrifying realization of what he had just done. He had left his husband. He had abandoned his sister's wedding. He had summoned a man the FBI had been trying to build a RICO case against for a decade. Instead, all he felt was the agonizing throb in his jaw. Dorian pulled a small silver first aid kit from the compartment, unzipping it with quiet efficiency. He pulled out a chemical ice pack, squeezing it in the center. The sharp crack echoed in the quiet cabin, followed by the hiss of the cooling chemical reaction. He didn't hand it to Liam right away. He turned toward him, his large frame shifting the leather seat. "May I?" he asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was the same tone he used to negotiate shipping routes or threaten politicians, but stripped of its usual venom. Liam nodded once. Dorian leaned in. His hands were large, knuckles scarred from a lifetime of enforcing his own rules, but his touch was impossibly light. He brushed a wet strand of hair away from Liam's temple, his thumb hovering just millimeters from his bruised skin. The heat radiating from his hand was a stark contrast to the freezing ice pack he gently pressed against Liam's swelling jaw. Liam hissed, a sharp intake of breath as the cold bit into the inflamed tissue. "Keep it there," Dorian instructed gently, guiding his hand to hold the pack. 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off. It will stop the swelling. Liam held the pack, leaning his head back against the headrest. He stared at Dorian. Under the dim, ambient lighting of the car's interior, Dorian looked exactly as he had 3 years ago. The sharp, predatory angles of his jaw, the cold, assessing pale gray eyes, the immaculate tailoring that hid a body built for violence. "You didn't ask what happened," Liam said, his voice muffled, distorted by the ice and the pain. Dorian reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to him. I don't need to ask what happened. I saw your face. I saw the way he looked at you. The details are just background noise. Liam took the flask. The dark liquor burned a trail down his throat, settling as a warm, heavy weight in his stomach. It helped stop the shivering. He told everyone I had a drinking problem. That's why I bruised so easily. That's why I was always clumsy. Dorian's eyes darkened, the irises swallowing the pale light. He looked out the front windshield, his jaw tight. A coward's tactic. Isolate the asset. Discredit the witness. It's textbook. I wanted a normal life. Liam whispered, the confession tasting bitter in his mouth. He stared down at his muddy knees. When I left you, Dorian, I told you I couldn't handle the paranoia, the guards, the secrets. I wanted a house with a lawn. A husband who went to an office. A safe, boring life. A heavy silence stretched between them, accompanied only by the hum of the engine and the splash of tires on wet asphalt. You found a monster hiding in a tailored suit, Liam. Dorian said softly, looking back at him. The world is full of them. The only difference is that my monsters wear their scars on the outside. We don't pretend to be saints. Liam closed his eyes. The truth of his words ached more than his face. He had traded a man who fought the world to protect him for a man who used him as a punching bag behind closed doors. He had confused legality with morality. Where are we going? He asked. Home, Dorian replied. My apartment. I don't have an apartment. You don't have an apartment anymore. Dorian interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. You don't have a car. You don't have a joint bank account. Marcus Trent is a ghost to you now. You are going to my house. The gates are 12 feet high. The glass is bulletproof. There are 6 armed men patrolling the perimeter. You are going to sleep. And tomorrow, we will figure out the rest. He didn't phrase it as a question. It was a command. For the first time in years, Liam didn't feel the urge to rebel against an order. He leaned deeper into the seat, the ice pack numbing his skin, and let the darkness of Dorian's world swallow him whole. Sunlight was a harsh, unforgiving intruder. It spilled across the enormous mattress, warming the heavy gray duvet that covered Liam. He lay perfectly still, tracing the geometric shadows on the ceiling. For 18 months, waking up required a mental checklist. Check Marcus's mood, check the placement of his shoes, determine the threat level before speaking. This morning, the only sound was the distant muffled hum of city traffic 30 stories below. He pushed himself up, ignoring the stiff ache in his muscles. The bedroom was massive, decorated in Spartan tones of charcoal, slate, and dark wood. It lacked personal touches, looking more like a high-end hotel suite than a home. Liam swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He was wearing an oversized black t-shirt he'd found folded at the edge of the mattress last night. It smelled faintly of Dorian's cologne, cedar, and black pepper. He walked into the attached bathroom and stood before the sprawling vanity mirror. The harsh LED lighting offered no mercy. The right side of his jaw was a mottled, horrifying canvas of deep violet, sickly yellow, and angry red. The skin was tight and swollen, warping the symmetry of his face. There was a small cut near his temple where he'd hit the brick wall. He stared at the reflection, tracing the edge of the bruise with a trembling fingertip. He didn't cry. The tears had dried up somewhere around year 1 of his marriage. What he felt now was a cold, hollow exhaustion. He washed his face carefully, wincing as the water hit his jaw, and walked out into the penthouse. The living space was an open-concept expanse of glass and steel, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Dorian sat at a massive oak dining table that served as a makeshift desk. He was dressed simply in dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the dark ink of a sprawling tattoo on his left arm, a serpent coiled around a dagger. Several open laptops and stacks of manila folders surrounded him. He didn't look like a man who had pulled a gun on an investment banker a few hours prior. He looked like a tired executive. There's coffee in the kitchen, Dorian said without looking up from a document. And eggs on the stove. Eat. Liam walked into the kitchen. A plate was waiting on the marble island, kept warm under a glass dome. He poured a mug of black coffee and carried it back to the living area, taking a seat at the opposite end of the long oak table. Dorian finally looked up. His eyes tracked the violent colors on Liam's face. A subtle tightening of his mouth was the only physical reaction he allowed himself, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, growing heavier. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Only when I breathe," Liam replied dryly. Dorian closed the folder in front of him. He pushed it aside, leaning his elbows on the table and lacing his fingers together. "My lawyer has already filed the restraining order on your behalf. We have a team boxing up your personal belongings from the house in the suburbs. Marcus is currently at work. He will return to an empty house. The locks have been changed, and the deed is being transferred." Liam stopped with his coffee mug halfway to his mouth. "You can't just take his house." "I can," Dorian corrected flatly. "I hold the mortgage through a shell company. He wasn't smart enough to investigate when he took out the loan. He missed a clause. He's in default." "Dorian, he's lucky I only took the house, Liam." Dorian stood, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked out over the city, a sprawling grid of millions of people, yet he seemed entirely isolated. "He's breathing because you asked me to come get you, not because I have a sudden respect for the sanctity of human life." He turned around, crossing the room slowly, pulling out the chair next to Liam's and sitting down. He didn't reach for him. He just sat close enough that Liam could feel the steady radiating heat of his presence. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" Dorian asked. The question hung in the air, stripped of anger, heavy with an exhaustion that matched Liam's own. Liam wrapped both hands around his warm mug. "Because calling you meant admitting I was wrong. I left you because I thought your world was toxic. I thought the violence would eventually consume me. I stood in this exact room 3 years ago and told you that you were a criminal, and I couldn't build a family with a man who had blood on his hands." Dorian didn't turn around. His broad shoulders remained perfectly still against the backdrop of the gray city sky. "I wanted to prove that I could find a good man," Liam continued, his voice cracking. "A man who went to charity galas. A man who built hospitals. I wanted the illusion so badly that I ignored the red flags. I ignored the way he gripped my arm. I ignored the way he spoke to waiters. By the time he hit me the first time, we were already married. And I was so ashamed of failing that I just stayed." Dorian turned around. He crossed the room slowly, pulling out the chair next to Liam's and sitting down. He didn't reach for him. He just sat close enough that Liam could feel the steady radiating heat of his presence. "You didn't fail, Liam," Dorian said, his pale gray eyes locking onto his. "You survived. You survived a predator who hid in plain sight. You survived long enough to make the call. That isn't failure." "I feel broken," Liam whispered, looking down at his coffee. "You're bruised," Dorian corrected gently. "Bruises heal. Bone knits back together. The rest of it, the fear, we will burn that out of you. You are going to stay here as long as you need. You are going to eat. You are going to sleep. And you are going to let me handle the monsters." Liam looked at him, searching his face for the catch, for the expectation of a dead ode. But there was only the quiet, terrifying devotion that had scared him away in the first place. "Why are you doing this, Dorian? After everything I said to you?" Dorian offered a faint, humorless smile. "Because 3 years ago, you walked out that door, and I let you go. Because I thought you were right. I thought you deserved a safer world than the one I could provide. But if the safe world is going to treat you like this..." His smile vanished, replaced by cold, absolute certainty. "Then I'm taking you back. And I dare God himself to try and stop me." 4 days blurred into a quiet, structured isolation. The violent purple on Liam's jaw oxidized into a sickly mottled yellow that spread down his neck. He lived in the oversized t-shirts and soft cashmere sweats Dorian had sourced, moving through the massive penthouse like a ghost haunting a glass castle. Dorian was always there, yet entirely unobtrusive. He didn't hover. He didn't ask probing questions about Liam's trauma. He simply existed in the periphery, working from the long oak table, speaking in low-clipped tones into a secure phone. He dismantled Marcus Trent's life with the same detached efficiency an accountant uses to balance a ledger. Liam watched him from the kitchen island, nursing his third cup of tea. Dorian was authorizing the liquidation of Marcus's firm's primary supplier. It was highly illegal. It was extortion. Liam felt absolutely no guilt. That was the terrifying part. 3 years ago, the casual cruelty of Dorian's world had made his stomach turn. Now it felt like justice. He realized with a bitter clarity that the moral high ground was a luxury for people who had never been beaten in their own home. Dorian ended his call and set the phone face down. He looked up, catching Liam's stare. "You're quiet," he noted, leaning back in his chair. "I was just thinking about the difference between you and him," Liam said, his voice raspy. The swelling in his jaw had gone down, making it easier to speak, but the psychological knot in his throat remained. Dorian's expression remained unreadable. "And what is the difference?" "Marcus hurt me because it made him feel big." Liam traced the rim of his ceramic mug. "He controlled what I wore, who I spoke to, how much I drank. It was petty. It was about making me small." He looked up, meeting Dorian's pale eyes. "You control cities. You break laws. But you never tried to break me." Dorian held his gaze for a long moment. He didn't offer a gentle platitude. He didn't deny his nature. "I destroy things that stand in my way, Liam. I am not a good man. But you were never in my way. You were the only thing I wanted to build." He stood, walking over to the kitchen island, and placed a sleek new smartphone on the marble counter next to Liam's tea. "Your old phone is at the bottom of the river," Dorian said. "This one is encrypted. My number is on speed dial 1. The security desk downstairs is 2. Liam looked at the black screen. "Who else has this number?" "Only the people you choose to give it to," Dorian replied. "But I took the liberty of calling your sister this morning. She is expecting a call from you whenever you are ready." Liam's stomach clenched. Margot. The wedding he had ruined. The family he had abandoned in the dead of night. Marcus would have spun a narrative by now. He was a master architect of lies, building facades to hide his rot. "What did he tell them?" Liam asked, his hands shaking slightly. "He told your parents that you had a mental breakdown," Dorian said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He claimed you relapsed into a severe depressive episode, ran off with a dangerous man you met at a bar, and that he is frantically working with private investigators to find you and get you into a psychiatric facility." A cold sweat broke out over Liam's ribs. It was brilliant. It painted Marcus as the tragic, devoted husband and Liam as the unstable Omega. If he went to the police now, his family would corroborate Marcus's story. "She's unwell. She makes things up." "They believe him," Liam whispered, squeezing his eyes shut. "It doesn't matter what they believe." Dorian's hand hovered over his on the counter, close enough to share warmth, but not touching. He never touched Liam without permission. "It matters what you can prove. Call her." Liam picked up the phone. He carried it out to the balcony, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind him. The cold city wind whipped his hair across his face, biting into his cheeks. He dialed his sister's number. Margot answered on the first ring. "Hello." "Margot, it's me, Liam." Margot's voice cracked, thick with exhaustion and panic. "Oh my God, Liam. Where are you?" "Marcus is out of his mind with worry. Mama's been crying for 3 days. You ruined the wedding. You just vanished." "I didn't vanish," Liam said, his voice remarkably steady. The wind swallowed his hesitation. "I escaped." "Escaped? What are you talking about?" "Marcus told us you were having an episode. He said you were drinking again and acting erratic. Please just come home. He wants to help you." "Margot, listen to me." Liam snapped, the sudden authority in his tone silencing his younger sister. "I am not crazy. I am not drinking. Marcus is a liar. He is dangerous. He loves you. He's been at our house every night looking at maps, hiring people." Liam pulled the phone away from his ear. He opened the camera app, turned off the flash, angled the lens to capture the harsh daylight, and took a picture of his face, the yellowing bruises, the cut on his temple, the swollen line of his jaw. He hit send. He put the phone back to his ear and waited. 10 seconds passed in silence. Then a sharp, ragged gasp echoed through the receiver. Did you get it? Liam asked softly. Liam. Margot choked on a sob. Oh my God. Oh my God, Liam. Did he do that to you? Yes, Liam said. He dragged me onto the patio at your reception and punched me in the face because he thought I looked at a bartender. If I had gotten in his car that night, Margot, I don't think I would have survived the weekend. Margot was openly weeping now, the sound raw and devastating. He was just here. He was sitting at our kitchen table drinking coffee. I hugged him. Don't tell him you spoke to me, Liam warned, his eyes scanning the busy streets below. Don't tell Mom and Dad yet. He is losing control of the narrative, and he is going to get desperate. Just lock your doors. Are you safe? Margot asked, her voice trembling. Marcus said you were with a criminal. A monster. Liam looked through the glass doors. Dorian was standing in the living room, a gun disassembled on the oak table. He was cleaning the barrel with meticulous, terrifying precision. He looked up, his pale gray eyes finding Liam's through the glass. I am with a monster, Margot, Liam said, the wind carrying his words away. But he's my monster. And for the first time in 18 months, I'm perfectly safe. Cabin fever set in by day 6. The penthouse, for all its expansive views and tailored comfort, was still a gilded cage. Liam needed to feel concrete under his feet. He needed to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through a luxury HVAC system. When he told Dorian he wanted to walk down the street to a small independent coffee shop, Dorian didn't argue. He simply stood up, holstered a compact firearm at the small of his back, and slipped on his dark wool coat. I can go alone, Liam said, though the thought made his pulse spike. No, you can't, Dorian replied smoothly, holding the front door open. Not yet, but I won't crowd you. The crisp autumn air hit Liam's face as they stepped out of the private elevator and onto the bustling sidewalk. The city was alive, indifferent to his trauma. Businessmen rushed past with briefcases. Tourists snapped photos of skyscrapers. It was violently normal. Dorian walked a half-step behind him, a silent shadow. 2 of his men, wearing plain clothes, trailed 30 yards back, blending perfectly into the pedestrian traffic. They reached the coffee shop. Liam ordered a latte, the mundane transaction feeling like a monumental victory. He carried the warm paper cup back out to the sidewalk, taking a deep breath of the exhaust-tinted air. Better? Dorian asked, watching his face carefully. Much, Liam said, offering a small genuine smile. The yellow bruise stretched tight, but it didn't hurt as much. They turned to walk back to the towering glass high-rise that housed Dorian's corporate front and penthouse. Liam. The voice ripped through the ambient noise of the street like a gunshot. Liam froze, his blood turning instantly to ice. The paper cup slipped from his fingers, splattering hot milk and espresso across the gray concrete. Marcus stepped out from the narrow alleyway between a deli and a bank, blocking the sidewalk. He looked horrendous. The impeccably tailored investment banker was gone. His designer suit was violently wrinkled, stained with sweat, and God knew what else. His hair was greasy, hanging in his bloodshot eyes. A dark, jagged bruise marred his neck, the exact shape of Dorian's thumb. Dorian didn't hesitate. He stepped smoothly in front of Liam, his body a solid wall of muscle shielding him from view. His right hand casually slipped beneath his wool coat, resting on the grip of his weapon. You have exactly 3 seconds to step back into that alley, Trent, Dorian said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It vibrated with a lethal promise. Marcus ignored him, his manic eyes trying to peer around Dorian's broad shoulders. Liam, they took my firm. My accounts are frozen. The bank seized the house. This animal is destroying my life. 2. Dorian counted, his pale eyes locked on Marcus's chest. The 2 guards in plain clothes were closing the distance fast, their hands also slipping into their jackets. You think you can just leave me? Marcus screamed, spittle flying from his lips. His public mask completely shattered. Pedestrians on the sidewalk began to scatter, sensing the impending violence. You think you can ruin me and walk away? I am your husband. Marcus lunged forward, a desperate, uncoordinated movement aimed blindly at Dorian to get to Liam. Dorian's reaction was terrifyingly fast. He didn't draw his gun. He stepped into Marcus's lunge, catching the man's outstretched wrist. Dorian twisted sharply, stepping through the momentum. A sickening wet snap echoed over the sound of traffic. Marcus let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek, his knees buckling as his forearm bent at a horrific, unnatural angle. He collapsed onto the concrete, clutching his broken arm to his chest, sobbing hysterically. The two guards arrived, grabbing Marcus by his collar and hauling him roughly to his feet, pinning his good arm behind his back. Dorian adjusted his cuffs, his breathing completely even. He looked at the weeping man with total disgust. "I told you what would happen if you looked for him. Call the police." Marcus wailed to the empty street, tears streaming down his face. "He broke my arm. Look at what he did. I am the police in this district, Marcus," Dorian said coldly. "And right now, you are trespassing." Liam stepped out from behind Dorian. His legs were shaking, but he forced himself to stand tall. He looked at Marcus. This was the man who had terrified him for 18 months. The man who had made him flinch at the sound of a closing door. The man who had convinced him he was worthless. Looking at him now, sobbing, broken, pathetic on the dirty sidewalk, the fear evaporated. He wasn't a god. He was just a bully who relied on locked doors and dark rooms. Stripped of his money, his house, and his secrecy, he was nothing. "Liam." Marcus gasped, his face pale with shock and pain. "Liam, please. Look at what he's doing to me. Tell him to stop. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I hit you. I was just stressed. Please." Liam stared at him, feeling the phantom ache in his jaw. "You aren't sorry you hit me, Marcus. You're just sorry he hit you back." He turned to Dorian. "I'm ready to go home." Dorian's eyes softened infinitely as he looked at him. He offered his arm. Liam took it, letting his heat ground him. They walked away, leaving Marcus screaming in the grip of the guards, his voice fading into the chaotic symphony of the city. As the elevator doors closed in the lobby, carrying them back up to the penthouse, Dorian looked down at him. "He won't ever come near you again," Dorian said. "My men are putting him on a freight train to the Midwest. If he comes back to this city, he won't leave it." Liam leaned his head against Dorian's shoulder. He was exhausted, but for the first time in years, his mind was quiet. "Thank you," he whispered. Dorian wrapped an arm around his waist, pulling him flush against his side. "I told you, Liam. You're mine to protect. That hasn't changed. That will never change." Winter arrived with a brutal, biting frost that encased the city in gray ice. Frost crept up the edges of the floor-to-ceiling windows, framing the sprawling metropolis below. Inside the penthouse, the climate was carefully controlled, warm and quiet. Liam's jaw had finally healed. The hideous yellow had faded into the natural porcelain of his skin. The physical damage was gone, but the psychological wreckage was still being sorted piece by piece, day by day. He spent his mornings reading on the velvet sofa, his afternoons walking the perimeter of the safe zones Dorian had established for him. He had a driver now, a massive silent man named David, who treated him like a fragile, priceless artifact. He had money. Dorian had deposited an obscene amount into an account solely in his name, telling him it was back pay for the years he had wasted. He didn't spend it. He didn't need to. Dorian worked late. He came home smelling of cold night air, exhaustion, and the heavy burden of consequence. He never brought the violence through the front door. He left his weapons in the biometric safe in the foyer, left his orders in the secured boardroom downtown. By the time he walked into the kitchen, unbuttoning his collar and rolling up his sleeves, he was just Dorian. One evening in late December, Liam sat cross-legged on the thick rug by the digital fireplace, reading a novel he couldn't focus on. Dorian walked in, his shoulders tight with exhaustion. He poured 2 glasses of amber bourbon, carrying them over to the fire, and handed one to Liam, sitting on the edge of the coffee table with his knees inches from his. "Rough day?" Liam asked, taking the glass. The heavy crystal felt grounding in his palm. "Port Authority disputes," Dorian murmured, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Bureaucrats who want a larger cut of a pie they didn't bake. Tedious." Liam took a sip. The liquor burned a sharp, familiar heat. You could walk away from it. You have enough money to buy an island, Dorian. You don't have to fight bureaucrats. Dorian looked at him, his pale gray eyes catching the flickering orange light of the fire. I don't do this for the money, Liam. I do this for the control. When you control the board, no one can move your pieces. He reached out, his large hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before his knuckles brushed gently against Liam's cheek, right where the bruise used to be. When you control the board, people you care about don't get hurt. Liam leaned into his touch. It was an instinctive, subconscious movement, but it made Dorian freeze. He let out a slow, measured breath, his thumb tracing the line of Liam's jaw. I was so naive, Liam whispered, closing his eyes against the warmth of his palm. 3 years ago, I thought monsters only existed in dark alleys. I thought if a man wore a nice watch and spoke well, he was safe. I was arrogant enough to judge you for being honest about what you are. You were looking for peace, Dorian corrected softly. There is no sin in that. I found it here, Liam said. He opened his eyes, meeting Dorian's steady gaze. In a fortress paid for by extortion and violence, with a man who broke my husband's arm without blinking. That makes me just as bad, doesn't it? Dorian set his glass on the table. He slid off the edge, dropping to his knees on the rug right in front of Liam. He took his glass, setting it next to his, and took both of Liam's hands in his. His grip was firm, anchoring him to the present. It makes you awake, Dorian said, his voice a low, rough rumble in the quiet room. This world is entirely teeth, Liam. You just finally stop pretending it isn't. And as long as I have breath in my lungs, nothing will ever sink its teeth into you again. He leaned forward, pressing his lips to Liam's forehead. It wasn't a kiss of aggressive possession. It was a seal, a vow forged in the wreckage of his old life. Liam exhaled, his shoulders dropping, the last lingering knot of tension dissolving into the quiet air. He buried his face in Dorian's neck, breathing in the scent of cedar and rain, finally completely at home. Coffee cups clattered against saucers in the private dining room of a Michelin-starred restaurant Dorian owned in the French Quarter. The restaurant was officially closed to the public until dinner service, but the kitchen had prepared a lavish brunch spread solely for 2 people sitting at the corner booth. Liam stirred his latte. Across the table, Margot looked terrified. His younger sister kept casting nervous glances at the 2 massive men standing by the double doors. They wore immaculate suits and earpieces, their eyes scanning the empty room with predatory vigilance. They aren't going to hurt you, Margot, Liam said, his tone gentle but firm. They are here to make sure no one else does. Margot swallowed hard, wrapping both hands around her untouched mimosa. Mom and Dad want to see you. They're confused. Marcus just disappeared. His firm went bankrupt overnight. The house went into foreclosure. The police found his car abandoned at a train station. It's like he was erased. He was, Liam stated plainly. Margot flinched. She looked at her older brother, really looking at him. Liam was wearing a tailored charcoal blazer over a silk camisole. His posture was straight, his chin tipped up. The haunted, fragile Omega who had stood at the altar a month ago was completely gone. In his place sat someone utterly untouchable. Did you do it? Margot whispered, leaning across the table, her voice trembling. Did Dorian kill him? No, Liam replied. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He offered the cold, unvarnished truth. Marcus is alive. He is working at a lumber yard in South Dakota under an assumed name. He lives in a 1-bedroom trailer. And he knows that if he ever tries to contact our family, or if he ever steps foot in this state again, he will not survive the trip. Margot stared at him, horrified and fascinated all at once. Liam, you're talking like a mobster. I am talking like an Omega who survived a coward, Liam corrected, leaning back against the leather booth. Marcus beat me for 18 months, Margot. Mom and Dad saw the bruises. You saw the bruises. Everyone bought his lies because it was easier than confronting the ugly truth. Dorian didn't look away. Dorian stopped it. If that makes him a criminal, then I will gladly stand beside a criminal. Tears welled in Margot's eyes. She reached across the table, grabbing Liam's hand. I'm so sorry. I should have known. I should have asked harder questions. Liam squeezed his sister's hand. The anger he had held on to for the last month finally began to dissipate, floating away into the ambient noise of the city outside. You couldn't have known. He was a master architect. He built beautiful facades. But I need you to understand something, Margot. I am not coming back to the suburbs. I am not going to Sunday dinners to pretend everything is normal. This is my life now. Margot looked at the armed guards, then back at Liam's calm, resolute face. Are you happy? Liam thought about the quiet mornings in the glass penthouse. He thought about the heavy, grounding weight of Dorian's hand on his back. He thought about the absolute certainty that he would never, ever have to be afraid of the dark again. I am safe, Liam said softly. And right now, that is so much better than happy. Hours later, the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city in shadows and gold. Liam stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the freezing wind whipping his hair around his face. He leaned against the glass railing, watching the millions of lights flicker on in the grid below. Behind him, the heavy glass door slid open. Dorian stepped out into the cold. He didn't wear a coat, just his dress shirt and slacks, indifferent to the biting wind. He stepped up behind Liam, wrapping his arms around his waist and pulling him back flush against his broad chest. How was the sister? Dorian murmured, his chin resting on the top of Liam's head. Terrified, Liam admitted, resting his hands over Dorian's forearms. But she understands. She knows I'm not coming back. Dorian tightened his grip, a silent possessive reassurance. They will adjust. People always adapt to the new reality when they realize the old one is gone. Liam leaned his head back against Dorian's shoulder, looking out at the sprawling, chaotic world Dorian ruled. It was a dangerous, violent empire. But within its center, wrapped in the arms of the Alpha who ran it, he was the safest Omega alive. He tilted his head, pressing a kiss to the pulse point on Dorian's neck. Thank you for coming to get me, he whispered into the cold night air. Dorian turned him in his arms. His pale gray eyes were entirely consumed by a dark, unwavering devotion. He framed Liam's face with his large hands, his thumbs brushing over his cheekbones. I would have torn the world down to the bedrock to find you, Dorian said, his voice a gravelly vow against Liam's lips. You just had to call. He kissed him. It tasted of bourbon and survival, of loss reclaimed and bridges burned. The city below them carried on, ignorant of the monsters and the broken things that found each other in the dark, building kingdoms out of concrete and bone. Winter melted into spring. The frost retreated from the windows, replaced by the soft gray of rain-soaked mornings. Liam found himself spending more and more time in the penthouse's study, a room Dorian had converted into a small library. He read voraciously, filling the quiet hours with words and worlds that had nothing to do with the empire humming beneath their feet. One rainy afternoon, he looked up from his book to find Dorian watching him from the doorway. The Alpha's tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, a thin sheen of exhaustion clinging to his features. But there was something else in his eyes, something soft, almost tentative. What? Liam asked, closing the book. Dorian crossed the room, lowering himself onto the arm of the reading chair. He didn't speak for a long moment, just looked at Liam like he was memorizing every line of his face. I've been thinking, Dorian said slowly, his voice unusually quiet. About. Dorian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The air in the room seemed to still. Liam's heart stuttered. I let you go once, Dorian said, his pale gray eyes never leaving Liam's. I convinced myself it was the right thing to do. I convinced myself that you deserved a world that wouldn't stain you. I was wrong. He opened the box. Inside was a simple platinum band, no diamonds, no embellishments, just clean, elegant metal that caught the gray light filtering through the windows. I'm not asking you to come back to me, Dorian said, his voice rough. You're already here. I'm asking you to stay. Permanently. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life, making sure you never have a reason to call me from the rain again. Liam stared at the ring. His throat was tight, his chest aching with something too large to name. Dorian, you don't have to answer now, Dorian said quickly, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his usually composed features. I know it's fast. I know you've been through hell. I needed you to know that this is real. That it's always been real for me. From the moment you walked into that coffee shop 3 years ago. Yes. Dorian froze. What? Yes. Liam laughed, the sound wet with sudden tears. Yes, you idiot. Yes, I'll marry you. There's nothing else I want. There's never been anything else I wanted. Dorian's composure cracked. His hands were shaking as he slid the ring onto Liam's finger, a perfect fit, because of course it was. Dorian had never done anything by half measures. 3 years, Dorian murmured, pressing his forehead against Liam's. 3 years I waited. And I'd have waited 3,000 more if it meant having you back. Liam cupped his face, tilting it up so he could look into those pale, fierce eyes. You have me, he said softly. You've always had me. I was just too stubborn to admit it. He kissed him. The rain continued to fall against the windows, soft and steady, a counterpoint to the wild beating of their hearts. The city sprawled beneath them, indifferent to their small miracle. But here, in the quiet of the penthouse, two broken souls found each other again, and this time, neither of them intended to let go. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn evening that mirrored the night Liam had first called, they stood in the penthouse's expansive living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city lights like scattered diamonds. A small gathering of people. David, the head of security, a few of Dorian's trusted lieutenants, Margot, clutching a handkerchief and crying openly, watched as the officiant smiled at the two men before him. Liam wore a simple charcoal suit. Dorian wore black. They stood facing each other, hands clasped, their scents intertwined in a way that felt less like a bond and more like a homecoming. Do you, Liam Calloway, take Dorian Blackwood to be your husband? To love, honor, and cherish, for as long as you both shall live. Liam looked at Dorian. He thought of the freezing rain on the patio at Ashford Estate. He thought of the moment he'd pressed the dial button, not knowing if the man on the other end would answer. He thought of every bruised day and shattered night, and how they had led him here, to this quiet moment, to this man, to this impossible, improbable second chance. I do, he said, his voice steady. Dorian's pale eyes glimmered. I do, he said, and the words sounded like a promise to the whole world. You may kiss the groom. Dorian leaned in, his hand cupping Liam's jaw with infinite gentleness. His lips brushed Liam's, soft and reverent. A cheer went up from the small crowd. Margot's sobbing grew louder. Liam pulled back just far enough to look at his husband, his alpha, his monster, his home. I love you, he whispered. Dorian smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that softened the sharp edges of his face. I know, he said. I've always known. The lights of the city blazed on below them. Somewhere out there were still monsters and broken things, still battles to be fought and empires to be ruled. But for now, just for now, they had each other. And that was more than enough.